Good afternoon to those of you joining us on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment for everybody to load into the webinar, we'll get started momentarily. Good afternoon and welcome to WITA. We hope you are staying safe and well. Before we get to today's event, we want to be sure you register for our 2021 Washington International Trade Conference, which will be fully virtual this year on February 8th and February 9th. We've launched our Black Friday sale early this year, and if you're interested in attending or sponsoring, you can find more information on our website, www.wita.org. We have a tradition here at WITA to call out the names of a few of the people who you are in community with at today's webinar, even if you can't see them. So a big welcome today to Mackenzie Fields with Speaker Pelosi's office, Deborah Marks at IBM, Ambassador James Zumwalt with the Japan American Society, and Bill Frymore with the Motor Equipment and Manufacturers Association and a former senior staffer for Congressman Dick Gephardt, for those of you who remember for Congressman Gephardt. Welcome Mackenzie, Deborah, James, and Bill. We're also delighted to welcome our special guests today, Congressman Jimmy Panetta and Dr. Orit Frankel of the American Leadership Initiative. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today at the WITA webinar platform to share your thoughts on trade and your work on both the Ways and Means and Agriculture committees. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, we ask you can ask questions using the Q&A tab found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of those questions today as we can after the discussion with Orit and the Congressman. Orit?
Thank you. Thanks, Ken. And thank you to Ken, Diego, and WITA for your partnership on this event with the American Leadership Initiative.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This is the 7th program I think we've done together. And it's been a great way to connect with members of Congress since we can't, unfortunately, meet in person these days. The American Leadership Initiative, or ALI, is creating a new vision and policy agenda for restoring American global leadership. And we are working with elected officials and their staff and a diverse group of thought leaders in business and society. You can learn more about us by going to american-leadership.org. So thank you, Congressman Panetta, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today. Congressman Panetta has represented California since 2016. He serves on the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, the House Agriculture Committee, and the House Budget Committee. So you have quite a full plate. Congressman Panetta has really dedicated his whole life to public service. In 2007, he volunteered for active duty in Afghanistan and worked with special forces and was awarded a Bronze Star for his service in combat. Prior to being sworn into Congress, he served his community as the Deputy District Attorney for Monterey County. Congressman Panetta represents a largely agricultural district comprised of many small family farms who typically farm specialty crops. During his time in Congress, he's been a strong advocate for the agricultural industry, as well as farmers in general. And he's also been interested in policies impacting climate change, which obviously have a big impact on California and his district. So the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee will obviously have a lot on their plate next year. So I'm looking forward to your thoughts about the agenda for the next Congress. So to start, as you know, agricultural exports are extremely important, particularly to California. And last year, farm exports fell. They totaled $136 billion, which was an $8 billion decline from the previous year. And I think that's largely been the result of tariffs that were imposed by China as the result of our war, trade war, and retaliatory tariffs imposed by the EU. And I know that your district has been hit by that, and that you are composed of farmers who grow specialty crops instead of row crops. Can you talk a little bit about how these tariffs and the trade war has impacted the farmers that you represent?
Sure. Well, thank you, Orit. I appreciate this opportunity. And obviously, thanks to the Washington International Trade Association, WITA, and Ken, thank you for introducing us. I appreciate this opportunity to have this type of discussion on an issue that obviously is going to be important as we get into the 117th Congress with the new administration, the Biden-Harris administration, which obviously, being in the majority in the House, we look forward to having. But also based on what we have here on the Central Coast of California. As you mentioned, Orit, and as we talked about earlier before we came online, we have a lot of beauty here on the Central Coast of California, but we also have a lot of bounty, as I like to say it. And we have a number of appellations because of it. I come from the salad bowl of the world, the berry bowl of the world, the artichoke capital of the world, the garlic capital of the world, and on and on and on. So you're right, we have a number of specialty crops, which I believe allow us to live up to all of those titles, to be frank. But you have to realize, though, is that when it comes to, obviously, they're fresh fruits and vegetables. So when it comes to China, it's not really, in dealing with China, it's not really our number one place, but we do make sure that we try to get into that market as well, just because of its potential, as you can imagine. And we just don't have unfettered market access to begin with. And it's never really been a kind of a leading export market for my growers. Now, that's not true, as you know, and kind of as you alluded to, for the soy, wheat, and corn, those big commodity crops there in other parts of California, other parts of our country. And so for those crops, I do agree. I mean, the president's trade wars have been bad for agriculture. And I know, now it's China's normal buying season this autumn. And I know the buying of those types of crops have gone up a little bit, but overall, and I think the evidence has demonstrated this, we've lost markets. And as you said, our exports are down. And now we were dealing with retaliatory tariffs on our agricultural exports, not just to China, but to India, to Turkey, and even the EU. So although you couldn't tell from some of the results of this past election earlier this month, many of our farmers, especially in the Midwest, are actually worse off than they were before this current administration. Now, as I mentioned in my district, some of the crops that we do export to China, lettuce, spinach, artichokes, garlic, strawberries, and blueberries, they face that additional 25% tariff in China, in addition to the regular most favored nation duties that they have to deal with. And in some cases now, they're going to have additional tariffs that were levied by China in retaliation for the president's steel and aluminum tariffs. So when it comes to my crops, as I stated, China has never been a leading export market for my growers. We have some strawberry exports to China that only represented a small amount of total exports, especially when it comes to strawberries. And part of that is China really places some tough requirements on imported strawberries. So it's just not worth the risk that they'll be rejected once they get there. And what I mean by that is, even if we're able to remove tariffs, to be frank, there are some unfair sanitary, phytosanitary measures that really just don't make it worth it. And I think that when it comes to China and the phase 1 agreement that we obviously saw, you hope that it will result in more market access. But it just seems that this administration only addressed these issues for a few selected exports when it comes to my specialty crops like blueberries and avocados, and really not much else when it comes to the crops that we grow here on the Central Coast. And then you still got those SPS challenges that remain for many other crops, and they're beginning to compound, especially when you have China just recently claiming that they were blaming some agricultural imports for COVID-19 outbreaks. And so it's sort of up against a lot of hurdles that you have to deal with when it comes to importing our specialty crops. Another thing, let me also mention what we're proud of here on the Central Coast, and that's our wine industry. Now, previously, when it came to wine, especially California wines, we enjoyed pretty big China market access. But unfortunately, they were hurt by the tariffs. And U.S. wine sales in China were growing for 20 years, despite tariffs of over 50%. But now U.S. wine exports to China are down year after year with a current tariff rate on U.S. wine at 93%. So the combination of retaliatory tariffs, existing non-tariff barriers, make it impossible for our growers who are hoping to make a few more inroads into that potential big market. So, what you hear about soy and wheat being harmed is true. I just think it's clear that in many other U.S. agricultural products, they're being harmed as well.
Yeah, so I know that your farmers are really struggling at this point, and the administration did authorize billions of dollars in assistance to farmers hurt by the tariffs, but as I understand it, most of that relief has really gone to the larger kind of grain farmers. And I wonder, have your farmers received any assistance? Has that helped?
Well, look, in regards to the market facilitation program, the MFP payments that we've heard about it and that you're referring to, it's unfortunate that they really were not dispersed equally. I mean, that's just to be frank about it. That's the evidence demonstrates that. And obviously, when the Trump induced the trade war with China, when it started, the USDA then created this 14.5 billion MFP program to provide direct payments to our farmers who are going to be hurt by this trade war. And the focus of it, unfortunately, I say that as a proud Central Coast resident and representative, the focus of the MFMBP was on traditional commodities, soybeans, corn, and wheat, like you said. Well, that's why myself and a fellow colleague of mine from the Central Valley of California, Josh Harder, immediately sent a letter to the USDA saying, wait a second, we got to include more specialty crops that have been harmed by these tariffs, making them eligible for the MFP. And the USDA responded, but only by adding a select few tree nuts and sweet cherries, unfortunately. And then in September of this year, the GAO actually put out a report demonstrating what I've said, that while the Trump administration's trade war harmed farmers across the country, the USDA assistance was not uniformly applied whatsoever, with most of the MFP payments in 2019 going to farmer operations that produced non-specialty crops. Less than 10% of MFP went to farming operations that produce specialty crops, dairy, or hogs. Now, most of the payments that have gone to the largest firms in this assistance has not really helped my family farms, who are increasingly, unfortunately, you see the bankruptcy numbers skyrocketing at this point for a lot of family farms across this country. And so the top 5 recipients of MFP received nearly half of the total of that funding. And yet you still saw bankruptcies rise by 20% for small, medium-sized farms in 2019 as a result of the trade war. And even with these high payments, unfortunately. And you also got to realize, I think what we got to, this is something else, another kind of piece of evidence that you got to add to it. The report that came out pointed out that the largest average MFP payments went to Georgia, the home of the Secretary of Agriculture, his home state. So I just think that we got to do a better job in Congress providing more oversight, especially when it comes to these types of payments, to make sure that they're spread out more equitably, especially when it comes to our smaller family farms.
Yeah, thank you. So just continuing on China for a minute, that there was they agreed to the phase 1 deal in January when China announced that it made a commitment to purchase about 36 billion of ag exports over the next couple of years, and actually also introduce more science-based phytosanitary standards, per your comment. I know that their imports to date have been a lot less than anticipated. Of course, COVID has had a part to do with that, which is understandable. But I guess, have these the additional imports been helpful? Have you seen them actually start to apply better standards? And in the past, over the past number of years, I mean, the Chinese have had from time to time these kind of purchasing agreements, and I wonder, are these short-term agreements helpful in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, Reed, I think you'll even admit that the amount that they had to purchase, that was pretty ambitious.
Yes.
Before we even had a pandemic. So right. I think it's been pretty tough for them to live up to those mandated purchases, unfortunately. And I mean that. And unfortunately, the China phase 1 deal, it just doesn't address some of the other major structural issues that we've had with our trade relationship with China, like its subsidies and its state-owned enterprises, which obviously the USTR raised in its Section 301 investigations into China's unfair trade practices. So there are a lot of questions about the underlying agreement and its efficacy. Like the phase one deal, it just doesn't address a lot of the other important issues that obviously we should be, I believe, as a democracy, should be concerned with, including the worker protections, environmental policy, human rights, and obviously what we've heard about over these past few years, the forced labor concerns coming out of China. So yes, like I said, there are when it comes to those types of purchases, it's sort of like a short-term Band-Aid because they're not actually based on consumer demand. It's much federal assistance. It really doesn't help in the long run. And don't get me wrong, I think we've seen it, and even here on the Central Coast, when they can get it, they'll take it. But what producers want, they want markets. They don't want handouts. And they will say that across the board, especially my producers right here on the Central Coast. Now, I understand, and I've had these discussions with people in the administration. They're going to say that the purchases help facilitate more trade, and they move forward and they forge relationships between exporters and importers. But I just think we know that the underlying conditions, such as the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers, are a bigger hurdle than simply finding an importer to work with. I mean, we saw China would fall short of these purchase commitments. It's like I said, especially during this COVID-19 crisis. And my specialty crop guys, they were largely not included in these purchase requirements, was focused on those traditional row crops that we talked about. And then you saw a report, the administration's report on the phase one purchases. Like I said, they highlighted soybeans, corn, sorghum, pork, and beef, but not fruits and vegetables in the report. And the only specialty crops that got highlighted in that report were pecans and peanuts. That's it, demonstrating that the specialty crops really were mostly an afterthought, unfortunately, when it came to these types of purchases. Now, obviously, you mentioned the SPS issues, as I talked about before, and it's true that the administration has made some progress on products like blueberries, avocados, and rice, but there's so many other crops, like especially strawberries, that face barriers that have just not been addressed, like I mentioned above. And so I hope that, what we see is as these barriers are getting worse, China is placing stricter COVID-19 testing requirements, unfortunately, on agricultural goods, and really ignoring the science, how the virus actually spreads. And so you're just seeing a compoundment of issue after issue that sort of offsets these purchases, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a challenging environment, and I agree with you that we need a much more, and this is something that ALI has done work on, we really need a much more strategic approach to China rather than these kind of little one-off deals.
Mm-hmm.
Well, moving across the globe, the U.S. is now negotiating an agreement with the U.K. And as you know, many of those sticking points have also been ag issues. We've got chlorinated chickens, hormone treated beef, GMOs, all sorts of other sticking points. And meanwhile, of course, the UK is caught up in negotiating its exit agreement with the EU and undoubtedly feeling some pressure to keep some of the EU standards. So what is your thought about, whether these issues can be surmounted? Do you think an agreement is in the offing? What's your thought about that?
I mean, in the limited discussions that I've had, and I actually got to meet with, a fortunate opportunity to meet with the foreign minister from the UK recently. There's no doubt that they have their hands full at this point. I think that's just kind of the nature of global trade at this point. But, especially the UK dealing with its exit from the EU by the end of this year, they're dealing with a lot. So I get that they're busy in those negotiations, and that it's tough when you know that they're basically negotiating the future economic and political relationship with the EU, you can imagine. But obviously that means that we're watching those negotiations very closely, because we do recognize that the outcome of those negotiations, they can affect the type of agreement that we can strike with the UK. Yes, there are some sticky points, like as you mentioned, And we have, we have those same sticking points with the EU around food safety and standards that you're seeing arise out of these negotiations. And obviously, what I'm hearing is, and seeing is that the UK does face a lot of pressure from their consumers and their farmers, and they like to maintain a very, very high food safety and animal welfare standard in most of their agreements, most of their free trade agreements. And their consumers seem really, they believe that products like chlorinated chicken and hormone treated beef, that they pose health risks. And that makes it tough because obviously, we're going to push back on those topics because I believe, and you see it with the science and the data, that they prove that genetically modified crops are safe. And so what I've heard is that the UK negotiators have been reluctant to agree to specifics when it comes to SBS practices, unfortunately. But I'm confident that our negotiators are doing everything they can. And I'm optimistic that we can make a little bit of headway just by talking about these issues, negotiating these issues. But unfortunately, the outcome on this particular issue is still up in the air. Now, looking at the broader agreement, the US and the UK, they've completed, as we know, their most recent round of negotiations, which I think was their 5th round. And we've been told that the negotiations were pretty robust and that the most recent round, which was completed on October 30th, covered 19 different chapter areas, which is quite a lot, if you can imagine. However, it's unlikely that these negotiators, that they're going to be able to come to an agreement and present a deal to Congress for our review to get ratified before the Trump administration leaves office. And the earliest date, I think, for the final negotiated agreement is likely, as we've seen, maybe in early 2021, most likely after President-elect Biden takes office. And because there, like I said, there's a lot of things that remain, a lot of issues that remain, and a big one that we're hearing about and obviously reading about, and we know about, is the struggle with Brexit and the UK struggle with Brexit. And if they don't come to an agreement with the EU soon, we don't want to see, the last thing we want to see, and we've made this clear, is that hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And when the foreign minister was here, Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Neal, and many of us made it clear that there's, if a UK deal should undermine the Good Friday Agreement, you're not going to have a deal. Unfortunately, when it comes to the Brexit, when it comes to our dealing with the UK. So there's potential for President Biden to find a pathway forward in the UK deal, but we got to overcome a lot of challenges, and the UK, it's got to come to a Brexit agreement that really, really upholds that Good Friday Agreement, which is so important, obviously, to our country and our nation going forward, and our relationship with the UK.
Yeah, they have a tall road in front of them. But kind of keeping on the EU theme, we've had this long-running dispute with the EU, as you know, on aircraft subsidies, and I think that's only gotten more contentious given, the COVID and the downward trend on aircraft sales. But recently, the EU, announced another round of tariffs that were cleared by the WTO on goods, many agricultural, but around $4 billion worth of retaliation. So how has that impacted your district in particular?
Well, let me just, it amazes me, and obviously as being a new member on the trade subcommittee and delving into these issues, it amazes me that this is one that's been going on for 16 years.
I was going to say I've been around, and Ken and I have been around a long time. It's probably longer that it's one of these issues that just keeps cycling back and cycling back and cycling back.
Yeah, and another person who I think agrees with this is Ambassador Lighthizer as well. And that, he understands that, obviously the EU tariffs were unfairly levied. And as they were meant to address a tax subsidy to Boeing that obviously Washington State had repealed earlier this year. And so while the WTO authorized the EU to retaliate to up to $4 billion, for noncompliance with the Washington state tax breaks, the WTO did not authorize the EO to levy the tariffs once we came into compliance, which we have. And so I think it just kind of goes back to the, the back and forth that's going on with this issue, unfortunately. Now, we obviously have the right to retaliate here, and at some point we need to sit down and settle this dispute instead of simply reacting with tariffs that are hurting our industries and could harm both the US and the EU. And so hopefully when a Biden administration comes in, it will be more willing to sit down with the Europeans and not poke them in the eye and come to an agreement that doesn't involve tariffs. And obviously the latest EU tariffs hit for specialty crops that I know of, sweet potatoes, grapefruits, cranberries, but didn't really impact the specialty crops in my district, fortunately. Yes, some nuts received tariffs, but California nuts like almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and pecans were all removed from the final list, which is good. Now, table grapes were also removed, which is good, but in particular, I'm concerned about the wine industry, as I mentioned earlier, because what you saw from our wine grape growers, they're concerned, not just the growers, but the wineries and the restaurants even. Alcoholic beverages have been a target in this dispute with rum, vodka, brandy, vermouth, all made in the US. Now they're being targeted in this latest round of retaliation. And what we don't want, we want to make sure that there's no tariffs on wine and spirits that could harm the entire industry and weaken the wine and spirits supply chains. In addition, like I said, to our restaurants who are already facing, trust me, I know it here being on the Central Coast, our restaurants who are facing a tremendous challenge during this pandemic. And so it's important to note that these products don't have anything to do with aircraft subsidies. Let's make that clear. That clear. And that's why I and many other members of Congress have consistently asked this administration to leave these unrelated products out of our tariff levies on the EU. And we understand, look, while the USTR has a right to retaliate against unrelated products, we should be a little bit more deliberate in thinking about what products tariffs can cause the harm on our domestic industries. I think is very, very important as we go forward.
Yeah, I think a lot of the tariffs that have been imposed, have ultimately, we've hurt ourselves even more than our trading partners. So it's frequently not the right response. And I certainly hope that, the Biden administration, I think, will really reach out to the EU on a lot of things and try to mend that relationship. And hopefully that will hopefully lay the groundwork to solve this particular round of the Airbus-Boeing dispute. Well, let me just touch briefly on USMCA. And I think, everybody was really pleased with that agreement. And it's been in effect now for about 4 months. And I think there has been, not unexpectedly, some criticism with how it's been implemented. And I wonder what your thinking is on that.
I appreciate that. And it was my first experience, and I proudly say, and actually having a hands-on involvement in the development and the passage of what I would call the most progressive hemispheric trade deal that the United States has ever entered into. And I do think it's a good example of how you saw Democrats and Republicans, the Democratic majority in this administration, work together on these types of trade deals. And it wasn't easy, I can tell you that firsthand. But I do believe it brought, the groups in, and we brought them in early on, and we had meaningful discussions to get to yes. And I got to give Ambassador Lighthizer credit. He, hands down, during the formulation, or the pushback, I should say, by the Democrats, he clearly, and I guess I got to say in the last 4 years, he was the one administration official that really was the most prevalent up on Capitol Hill, to be frank. I'd never seen an administration official so prevalent, so present on Capitol Hill than Ambassador Lighthizer. So he worked very hard in getting all of us to yes, which was good. And I got to say, now, if for my district, the USMCA, it just gave my ag producers a lot of certainty. to be honest with you, which was something that was needed based on a previous discussion just within the last few minutes about how there was so much uncertainty and unpredictability when it came to foreign trade. This kind of solidified a lot of the agreements under NAFTA that were already there for my guys that really helped them and our producers. So very, very important. And like I also said, you know, it not only talked about our relationships in Congress, but it also is an example of how Congress can assert itself when it comes to these types of trade agreements, to be frank. Now, obviously, you know, early on, we realized that the renegotiated USMCA, as it was presented to us on the Democratic side, it wasn't up to the standards that we could accept. And not just us. I'm not just talking about members of the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. I'm talking about other Democrats as well who had to vote on this thing. And it obviously, you know, it wasn't enforceable. It failed to include strong labor and environmental protections. And it included provisions that would limit the prescription drug affordability as well. And so we on the Ways and Means Committee worked very hard, obviously externally, in the sense that I was part of a group led by Richie Neal, went down and met with President Obrador, him and his cabinet, literally in a room no bigger than my office right here, and sort of worked out some of the hard details that we're having a tough time with. But also internally, within our own Democratic caucus, then coming back and then selling it to other Democrats in our caucus to get them to yes as well. And so I thought that was very important. I think it is something to highlight in regards to the passage. Now let's talk about the progress. And I think, you know, I think we do need to continue to have that type of same involvement, to be honest with you, as we showed in formulating it. We have to show in making sure it works, to be honest with you, and providing the oversight and implementation of this agreement. Now, unfortunately, you saw a report come out by the Ways and Means Committee recently, a report card on the USMCA. And it kind of demonstrates that the USMCA and some of the parties are not living up to their agreement. And so we got some work to do in some areas, and then in other areas we don't have so much. But I think what certain areas we got to look at is obviously some of the good things that we got, the environmental funding. And look, I admit that this administration, and it was tough, didn't do as much on climate and climate change, and didn't even want those words in the agreement. But you got to realize what we got when it came to our environment. And as I tell my progressive folks here in California, this is a deal where we got the administration to pay California to help our environment. And I have to repeat that for them. Once again, this deal allowed the federal government to pay California to basically clean up our environment, and something that they don't really realize when it comes to the USMCA. And such things as like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, spending the money recently appropriated to combat illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing and other priorities that benefit the health of our oceans. And then NOAA recently announced the new grant program funded by USMCA to remove and prevent more marine debris. More needs to be done, though. I don't know if you saw 60 Minutes within the last few months, and the piece that they keep on showing, I've seen it twice now, is about the issues in regards to the Tijuana River and the cleanup that's there on that that's necessary on that river. We appropriated $300 million for the EPA's Border Water Infrastructure Program to help clean that up for its shared waterways that really, especially if you saw that 60 Minutes report, they need that, as well as to prevent future pollution going forward. And then obviously we need to pass a USMCA technical corrections bill to carry over language from NAFTA that authorizes the North American Development Bank to use its $225 million capital increase. And what you'll see is, look, we're happy with the efforts to engage on these environmental issues, but we need to use all of the available tools to hold Mexico accountable for enforcing its own environmental laws, is really what it comes down to. And let me just hit on one more. Ken, I saw you pop in, but just hold on.
Yeah.
Let me just hit on one more. And that's something that's personal to me. It's personal to my district. We got to make sure that they abide by the notification requirements. And what I mean by this is just recently, we had Canada enact certain requirements on a certain crop, romaine lettuce, just from the Central Coast, and that they impose certain standards on romaine lettuce just coming from my area without abiding by the notification requirements that are in Chapter 9 of USMCA. And so, you know, you understand that there are some issues, some safety issues. We understand that, but do it the right way. And we just don't want them setting precedent by disregarding the notification requirements. And so I do think that we're continuing to push back. FDA, USTR, USDA are pushing back on Canada because of this. We just got to make sure that they don't set precedent in doing this for these types of crops for all of our products, especially when it comes to this agreement.
Well, this has been great. You've been terrific, and I have more questions, but I know that Ken is chomping at the bit to get Q&A, and I see that we have some questions lined up. So,
well, I would say the congressman has raised a lot of things that we all care about. Romaine lettuce,
and
for
there's
sure.
a lot of follow-up.
And I will say the WITA membership cares a lot about the wine and spirit supply chain. So really support your good work on those initiatives. So we just want to get to a few of the audience questions if we could. Admiral Zumwalt actually has a really interesting question. It combines with a couple other ones, but one having to do with U.S. agricultural exports and tariffs on tariff issues and phytosanitary barriers on U.S. ag exports. Do you think that we should be negotiating new trade agreements to try to lower some of those barriers for U.S. agriculture? And, you know, I think that relates back to TPA, which expires next year. You know, what would you need to do to be able to get TPA passed so that you can negotiate some of these trade agreements that might be able to help U.S. ag exports?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is of course we need to start talking about sanitary, phytosanitary issues, because you can see how they can easily be used as non-tariff barriers, unfortunately. And I think we need to make that basically that needs to be a part of any sort of negotiation that we have with any country, especially when we're dealing with fresh fruits and vegetables, because they're so easily subject to those types of non-tariff barriers that could easily come up, and it's unfortunate. And so we need to do our best to make sure that there are certain requirements in place using science-based standards to make sure that those countries abide by those types of regulations. And when it comes to the TPA, I believe that we need to make sure that members of Congress understand how important it is that it really gives us our say in these types of agreements and trade agreements. And to be frank, yes, you have a lot of members of Congress who, you know, you have a few that are on the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, and you have a few others who are interested in trade. But I'm not sure how many people understand the history of the TPA and what it actually provides us the opportunity to do and actually be a part of these negotiations early on, considering it's an up or down vote on these types of agreements. It doesn't go through the normal committee process. You don't get it voted out. It doesn't, you know, it's not subject to amendments or anything like that. Therefore, people need to be involved in these types of agreements early on. Congress needs to be involved in those agreements early on, in those negotiations early on, to be frank, so that when it gets to Congress for that up or down vote, people understand that. And so I think we need to make sure that we educate our members, to be frank, a little bit more on how important TPA is, and that we renegotiate it, or excuse me, that we pass it prior to the July deadline that's coming up here. I can't stress how important that is. So it's obviously an education that we need to have amongst everything else that we're going to be dealing with come January of 2021, to know that obviously in dealing with the Biden administration, they're going to have their priorities domestically. But obviously when we start talking about foreign trade, a TPA, it needs to be put forth in Congress that TPA is very important as a part of that as well, especially considering when he's talking domestic, how important and how tied in foreign trade is to our domestic workforce as well.
So thank you. And thinking of oversight and the role that you play, you know, you mentioned about the oversight of the trade and ag payments. And I don't know if that's something that's in the Ways and Means jurisdiction or the Ag Committee jurisdiction, but in Ag Committee, you also have a farm bill that'll expire. It's a bit of a ways off, but what kind of provisions do you think you could be seeing that the Agriculture Committee might support that would help promote exports as well? Are there some things that we can be doing there?
Yeah, look, I think it's something that I've been advocating for, you know, as I did in the last 2018 Farm Bill, and that's one of the minor parts of the Farm Bill, is because it's very large, as you know, is the Market Access Program, MAP, MAP, making sure, like I said, especially after these last 4 years, where a number of markets just kind of went away. We need to make sure that we continue to have these types of programs that facilitate markets and make markets more accessible to our farmers. And like I said, I can't stress that enough. And what I said to Ori is that, you know, a lot of my guys, we're not used to subsidies. And in fact, let me just digress and talk about CFAP, the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program that sort of was modeled after the MFP during the pandemic, and the money that came from the federal government in the CARES package to our agricultural producers. A lot of that was unequally distributed to them because we didn't have the data to support why we should get that, unlike the row crops in the Midwest who had that data, immediately submitted it, and immediately got their money. My guys out here, they didn't know how to do that, and we had to work with them and show them this is the data that's needed, this is how you submit it, and this is how you go forward. And so, like I said, we're not used to subsidies out here. We don't want to rely on subsidies out here. And I guarantee if you talk to the farmers in the Midwest, they don't want subsidies either. They want markets. And so I do believe that when it comes to the Farm Bill, continuing to ensure that there are these programs that assist our farmers in getting these types of markets in other parts of the world, that's what they're going to benefit from more than any other subsidy. I truly believe that.
So thank you. We're wrapping up. We're running out of time here. I know Orit wanted to circle back on environment before we close, but I did want to ask, you know, the phase 1 deal with China, this comes from Mary Berger, you know, didn't really get to some of the critical issues like subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and other non-tariff barriers. Do you see that, you know, that's going to be something that you're going to press for as a priority with the Biden administration? And there's so many other things they need to be doing, of course, COVID relief, the American economy, but, you know, on the trade front, do you see this as something that they could, you know, walk and chew gum on at the same time and hopefully get something done on that front?
Well, I'm always, I'm always optimistic that as a democracy, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, because there's always plenty of issues that we're dealing with. And so, but it also just tells you that they should have dealt with these issues in phase 1, to be frank. And unfortunately, it leaves you with the sentiment that this deal was come to an agreement more to just get the agreement rather than looking at some substance behind some of these issues that were brought up in that question. And so, look, I think they have to be addressed, but how do you address that? And do you get back to a phase 2 discussion these are tough issues. These are very tough issues. And do you continue to do it in a bilateral sense, or do you then start talking about what we have been hearing about, using our allies to come to some sort of agreement kind of surrounding China? I mean, I don't know if you guys read The Economist. I mean, you know, this is and I'm sorry to promote this, but I'm a big Economist believer. And on this article right here, the one that's in there, I mean, they basically, you know, it goes so far as basically talking about entering into some sort of treaty similar to an enlarged G7 that can basically talks about having some sort of not dealing with conflict, but more of collaboration and dealing with taxation, takeover rules, and supply chains with our allies surrounding China. So it'd be a good article to, I would recommend that you take a look at, and that's the type of thinking we're going to have in dealing with China. And I do believe that President-elect Biden understands this. Obviously, like I said, his focus at first are going to be domestic issues, dealing with the pandemic relief, but understanding how many jobs are tied into foreign trade, 12.2% of GDP, and supporting 39 million jobs is our foreign trade, realizing how important those are. He's going to have to start looking at these agreements, going to have to start looking at China and how you deal with China, be it a bilateral phase 2 or something as grand as doing this type of ally treaty engagement to surround China and focus on them.
Well, thank you. Orit, did you want to wrap up on anything on environment? I know you wanted to ask something, and then we need to really wrap up. We're kind of over time as it is.
I'll sneak in a question. So yeah, I think the Biden administration will have to grapple with China early on. But as you know, another big issue on their radar is climate. And I think that's going to be a huge priority. They'll join, you know, Paris probably right away. And they have a whole slate of initiatives to emphasize, you know, to work on climate change, sustainable farming. And I just wanted to see, you know, what what your perspective is and the perspective of your farmers in terms of how some of these new policies might impact them.
Yeah, I am very, very lucky out here in California, and the Central Coast of California in particular. Our farmers out here are some of the most progressive farmers I know of, and also the most productive farmers that I know of, to be frank. And I think it's because they're so progressive, that's why they're so productive, especially understanding that, look, if anybody is worried about the air, the water, and the soil, in order to succeed, it's our farmers. And therefore, we got to have certain standards on them and make sure that on those types of areas, to make sure that they protect and preserve them to have the products that they do. And so we're very lucky around here that we get that. But also around here, what we've realized and what we've seen, and we're not just victims, not just witness, but victims of the effects of climate change, in the sense that last summer we had a horrible wildfire season. And so we, not just with the structural damage, there was damage to our crops because of it. So knowing that, it's not just about looking at your products on the ground and the technology and the precision farming that comes into play in order to deal with the environmental aspect, the immediate environmental aspects of it, but it's looking at the climate in a bigger picture, understanding that it's going to affect their products in one way or the other, especially as an example, using these wildfires and the smoke taint that damaged a lot of crops out here. And so I do believe that it's that type of attitude that we got to make sure that farmers like mine, and I will say that because I'm proud of them, farmers like mine are at the table when we have discussions about climate policy. You can't just sit there and say, oh, we got to make this huge change and this is how it's got to be, and expect the farmers just to go along with it. It's like with anybody, bring them to the table at first, get them involved in the discussions, and you'll see, especially with progressive thinking people in agriculture like I have out here on the Central Coast, they're going to contribute to it, not take away from it. And so I think it's got to be that big step of making sure they're at the table to be involved in the discussion, contribute to the discussion about making sure that we address climate change going forward.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, for your time. We've run over. We appreciate your generosity with your time. Orit, thank you very much for bringing this event to the WITA platform. We're very grateful to ALI. Congressman, we got, there were about a half dozen more questions we didn't get to. I'm going to share those with your staff.
Please.
And that way they can, hopefully, if they want to get back to a couple of the people, they can try to do that directly that way. Thank you so much. Be well. Take care. Have a lovely holiday. Stay safe. And we look forward to hosting you in person at WITA when it's safe to do so. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
the opportunity.
Thank you, Congressman.